It's not that you at one point in time, for example, during data pre-processing or model, could take care of bias and then everything is fixed and you don't have to look at it anymore. So unfortunately, there's not one single secret sauce recipe that I could give your listeners to tell them, hey, if you do that, then your models will always be fair and everything will be fine. So that's definitely not the case.
Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of the D4 Data Channel podcast. I'm your host Deepak, and with me we have Ms Alexandra Ebert. Alexandra is the Chief Trust Officer at Mostly AI, and she is closely working on synthetic data and ethical AI. Alexandra is a speaker at international conferences on AI, privacy, and digital banking, and hosts the Data Democratization Podcast. So today we are talking a lot about responsible and ethical AI and how it's important in the current AI landscape. And it's great to have you here today, Ms. Alexandra, and thank you for accepting my invite.
It's a pleasure to be here, Deepak. Very much looking forward to talk with you.
Great. So I have a couple of questions for you today, and starting with this one. So, based on your experience, so what are the major ethical concerns about using an AI system in the present scenario?
The main concern, well, good question to kick off. I would say one thing to highlight is that it's not necessarily AI where we have huge ethical concerns. I mean, partially, but in general, it's also about making sure that, particularly when we talk about fairness in algorithms, that we don't perpetuate the historic injustices, prejudices, and biases that we as humanity have exhibited for the last centuries and beyond. So I think that's one of the major concerns, figuring out how we can correct data, correct algorithms to make sure that they don't discriminate. But of course, we also want to develop AI in a responsible way, ethical way, trustworthy way that's oftentimes used synonymously to make sure that humans have the ability to intervene and that it's human-centric and beneficial for society at large.
Okay, got it. So over to my next point. So what are the viewpoints on responsible AI concept and why it is so important at this phase?
Mhm. Two things. So one point why responsible AI is so important is we want to develop artificial intelligence, and with we, I mean the complete ecosystem of AI vendors, but of course also the users and organizations deploying these solutions, because it's the right thing to do. We want to have AI that's supporting and not replacing humans. Besides that, when you look into all the ongoing regulatory developments and also the initiatives for responsible AI going on within enterprise organizations, a motivating factor is also to build trust in AI systems. Because if we look into the requirements for responsible AI, you oftentimes see elements like fairness, as already mentioned, transparency and explainability. You want to be able to look into this black box of machine learning models and better understand how and why they came to a decision. Of course, you want to also have models that are developed in a privacy preserving way and that are secure, robust, accurate, and where human oversight can be guaranteed. So these are some of the criteria for responsible AI. And all of those are something that regulators and organizations deem to be important to have for trust in artificial intelligence, because they all know if we as the general public are not trusting artificial intelligence, then this technology won't be used and we won't be able to reap the benefits of it.
Got it. Got it. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, so what are the typical bias observed when using these kind of larger AI models, and how we can address them?
Mhm. Mm, I wouldn't necessarily say that bias is significantly different depending on the model size. We briefly talked before starting off the show about very large NLP models. I'm not an expert particularly for NLP, but what I can tell the listeners in general is that bias, unfortunately, is a rather complex topic. It's not one single point in the value chain or life cycle of an algorithm that bias comes or can creep in and needs to be addressed. It's really something that you have to think about right from the beginning. And with the beginning, I mean when you're discussing whether you should even use AI for a certain problem. Then also with data collection, the data that you already have during the model training in the post-processing stage, and then also during monitoring when the model is in production. But to give a few more tangible examples, one of the most common problems when we talk about bias in AI is the data. And here it could either be the historic biases that I mentioned. So there was a few years ago this situation where Amazon decided, well, it would be quite nice with the thousands and 10,000s or even 100,000s of applicants that we get per year to have an AI algorithm tell our HR department which candidate to invite to the interview and which not. And the problem here was they trained it, if I remember correctly, on 10 years worth of historic Amazon employment records. And if we think back 10 years ago, or even if we look into the workforce today, there's still a quite big gap between how many females are in middle or senior management positions and how many males are. And therefore, it was quite natural for the algorithm to learn, okay, if it's a senior management position, I'm much more likely to recommend a male candidate to this interview because they just seem to be more suitable. And that's a bias that we, of course, don't want to perpetuate. And this was also one of the reasons why Amazon quite quickly pulled this algorithm back and didn't use it. So historic biases are one problem. Another problem is data collection. We all know about GDPR, the California Consumer Privacy Act, and all the other state privacy laws that are currently emerging in the United States and many other international new privacy laws that are emerging. So for many organizations that want to train artificial intelligence, it's oftentimes a problem to get enough data in the region where they want to develop the algorithm. I'm not sure if this is something that's a topic your listeners frequently are in touch with, but particularly cross-border data sharing is something that's tremendously cumbersome and difficult. So just imagine a large organization that wants to develop an artificial intelligence system that's not only planned to be used, let's say, in the United States, but also in Europe, in Asia, in Africa, South America, and so on and so forth. And to make sure that the system works properly for all these different nationalities, cultures, and so on and so forth, data would be needed to train the model on all those different populations. But since data sharing is so difficult, in the real world, we oftentimes see organizations developing their data set only on, let's say, US data and then rolling this out to the world. Or another problem is just simply the data collection point in regards to if you think of an organization and their customer base, not always do they have the full spectrum of human diversity in their customer base. And they will also have minority groups, being this from an ethnicity point of view, from a sexual orientation point of view, whatever. And we all know artificial intelligence needs plenty of examples to properly work for a group. So if an organization trains an algorithm on a skewed data set where there are only a handful of examples for, let's say, Native Americans or Black people or something like that, then the model could be discriminatory and not work properly for those individuals. So I would say data is one of the most important elements to address when fixing bias, but it's also the diversity of development teams and people involved in the development process and many, many other criteria.
Great explanation actually, like covering all the important facets of the process basically. So over to my next point. So uh, so this is something which I'm not sure actually. Like recently there have been some news related to self-driving cars and stuff whenever those kind of AI is actually making some mistakes. So like who is actually responsible for AI's mistakes?
I must say I'm not a lawyer and therefore I'm potentially not the best person to answer this question, but I know that the question of liability, who's to blame, who's responsible when AI is doing a mistake, is something that's heavily discussed in the legal community, because particularly when you have AI that's more independently taking decisions, it's quite challenging to pinpoint, okay, is it now the user? Is it the organization that put out the system? Is it the provider of the AI component? We all know that not everybody starts from scratch when they develop an AI product or an AI-powered product, but they potentially take pre-trained models from large tech brands and so on and so forth. So I can't tell you, and I think this is still one of the issues that we need to figure out as a society.
True. So my next point. So, like, what are the different fairness infill techniques available to ensure the fairness of these AI models?
Fairness infill is, how do you define that?
So let's say like there are some techniques where we can inject the what to say a process
Hmm.
into the existing model so that like we mitigate that quality of bias or like this kind of data bias basically.
Yeah,
So I think you have yeah, some of them actually you mentioned earlier like regarding how we are inspecting the data and
yeah.
stuff. But like is there any other ways of major techniques which is widely applied
Mhm.
actually?
Good point. So maybe a two-part answer to that. As I already mentioned beforehand, it's not that you at one point in time, for example, during data pre-processing or model, could take care of bias and then everything is fixed and you don't have to look at it anymore. So unfortunately, there's not one single secret sauce recipe that I could give your listeners to tell them, hey, if you do that, then your models will always be fair and everything will be fine. So that's definitely not the case. One thing that can be done and where we are also pioneering in the work of fairness is, for example, fair synthetic data. I'm not sure if the listeners know synthetic data. So before I explain fair synthetic data, I'll first start with synthetic data. AI-generated synthetic data is a new technology to anonymize big data assets. In contrast to the anonymization techniques that were available before, it works fundamentally different. So what did we have before? Before we had something like masking, obfuscation, and so on and so forth. And these legacy anonymization techniques have two problems. One is they are destructive in nature. They destroy data utility because you go over an original data set, let's say the financial transactions of an organization or the healthcare records of an organization or the customers of this organization, and they go over this data set column by column and kind of mask, obfuscate, distort, delete certain parts of the data points to make sure or hope to achieve anonymity and hope to achieve something where you can't come back to the original data and protect the privacy of the individuals. This process is so destructive that particularly in an AI context, there is not much left because if you have hundreds and hundreds of columns, which is very common in today's big data world, with those techniques, you only can have two, three columns intact. And if you have more, then you oftentimes run into re-identification risk. So that's one problem. The second problem is that research in the recent years has demonstrated over and over again that it's terribly hard to successfully anonymize data with legacy anonymization techniques. And as soon as it's big data, so financial transactions, your healthcare records, or your shopping purchase behavior on Amazon and what the like, it's impossible. So even, for example, to illustrate it with an example, even if there are only tiny bits of information left in a data set, re-identification risk is huge. And there was a study done a few years ago where they looked at credit card transactions. We all know we usually have like a few dozens, if not a few hundred credit card transactions per year. And the researchers found that if you only took 3 out of those hundreds of transactions that individuals have, and anonymize them in a way that you not even reveal everything about this transaction, but only the merchant and only the date of the transaction. So I don't know, yesterday Starbucks, the week before Walmart or something like that, and then a third data point. Only these tiny bits of information are sufficient to re-identify over 80% of individuals in that data set. So you see, you can't really keep anything and you still have a huge privacy risk. And this was an issue for many organizations, particularly since the introduction of GDPR, because they were in this kind of conundrum of having to figure out how they can use their data assets for data innovation, for AI training, and at the same time protect their customers' privacy and comply with these regulations. And this is where synthetic data came in, where you have a fundamentally different approach to anonymizing data assets. So in contrast to legacy anonymization, where you always stick with the original data set, but just try to manipulate it in a way that it hopefully is anonymous. And I hope I've just established that unfortunately it's then not anonymous. With synthetic data, you only take the original data as learning material. So you have a powerful deep learning model that's capable of automatically learning all the patterns, the correlations, the time dependencies in a given data set. So basically, the AI is capable of understanding how a given organization's customer base acts and behaves. And this knowledge is then taken, not the data, just the knowledge about the data, to create new synthetic customers, and let's say they're synthetic financial transactions. And from a statistical point of view, from a utility point of view, the synthetic data set and the original data set will nearly be indistinguishable. So if you were to train an AI model on the synthetic newly generated data and on the original data, you would get nearly the same results. So in practice, we see differences with our customers from 0.2% or something like that. But the benefit with these artificial customers is that while you preserve the generalizable patterns down to a very granular level, you don't have any single data point in there that directly relates to a real world individual. So it's impossible to link the data, to re-identify the data, and to come back to the original once it's synthesized. And this is a way of anonymizing data that's compliant with GDPR, CCPA, and all the emerging privacy regulations out there. And that's the only one suitable for complex behavioral big data assets. So very long explanation about synthetic data. Now coming to fair synthetic data. I mentioned already earlier that one of the problems in our data is that we oftentimes have these historic biases present. That, for example, we have some discrimination against certain ethnicities or gender and so on and so forth. With fair synthetic data, you train a model in a way that it's not only tasked with learning the generalizable patterns as accurately as possible, but you also task it to fulfill a fairness constraint. So the way we do is we allow our customers to select one of the many fairness definitions that are out there. And according to this fairness definition, the model creates a new data set where it, for example, gives you more high-earning women and their realistic spending behavior to make sure that models that are trained on that or support, it's not the silver bullet solution. So as I mentioned, you need to do many things to fix bias, but it's definitely helping downstream models that are then trained on this privacy-safe, fair synthetic data to not pick up historic gender biases in regards to payment, for example. And that's a quite beautiful process. I actually will soon have a podcast episode out there with Humana, where we talk about how they use fair synthetic data. Humana is a healthcare insurance, how they use fair synthetic data to make sure that they provide their services in an equal and non-discriminatory manner.
Yeah, that's actually pretty cool, the technique which you actually mentioned. So maybe like you should definitely try it on to the other domains also. Like I'll
Mhm.
definitely have a look into it. So yeah, so over to the next couple of aspects related to responsible AI. So regarding the bias and the levels of concern, so like I could find like there are three levels of concern on bias and whether the model is unfair or unethical. So according to like how is it currently handled, or like what should be the approach which our AI practitioner or AI practitioners should actually take when they are actually developing a AI
Mhm.
project in specific?
It definitely needs to be a holistic process. So it can't be the way forward that this burden rests on the shoulders of data scientists, because what is fair and what is not is something that's so different depending on which person you ask. I oftentimes give this example with my fictitious nephew and niece. Imagine he is like, I don't know, 6 years old, she's 3 years old, and I have 6 pieces of chocolate. If I were to give both kids 3 pieces of chocolate, some could say, or some could argue, that's fair. But then the older boy would, for example, say, well, I'm the bigger one. I should get 4 pieces. My little sister should only get 2 pieces. That would be fair. And her argument might be, well, she did the dishes yesterday with her dad, so she earns 4 pieces and he should only get two because he was lazy watching TV or something like that. So fairness is a highly, let's say, difficult to pin down topic. And if you want to make sure that an algorithm is fair, you have to derive with a mathematical fairness definition of, okay, what's actually fair in a given point of view. And this decision is something that data scientists shouldn't be burdened with to take alone. But in many organizations, what works quite well is that they introduce something like an AI ethics board or something like that, where representatives from different departments, from particularly with large organizations, different regions of the organization, with different cultural backgrounds and as diverse as possible for that organization, come together to decide, okay, in which direction do we want to go. In some instances, it's also regulations that tell you which fairness definition to use. But unfortunately, that's still quite a wide gap that regulators need to fill and decide, okay, all organizations out there, watch out, this is the fairness direction you should go. So oftentimes it's quite tricky to derive with that fairness definition. Besides having the AI board in place and deciding, okay, what's fair, which is also highly unique to the use case, you need to have tools in place to make sure that when you develop the algorithm, when you pre-process the data, or even with some constraints after the model is ready trained, fulfill your selected fairness definition. In many organizations, particularly also again larger ones, what works quite well is when they also have a kind of, let's say, pre-deployment check where internal teams need to present their algorithm and an independent team is verifying for fairness to make sure that this is really something the organization is comfortable to put out there in the real world. But of course, we know models can also change afterwards, and situations, circumstances can change, or there could be something that you didn't even consider in the first place. So it's also important that you have a process in place how to regularly make sure that your models are checked for fairness, that there are ways how users or affected parties can intervene, and so on and so forth. So it's really not only a technical point or a technical topic to address, but also an organizational and procedural point.
Understood. Yeah. So over to the importance of responsible AI, like, and how it's being handled currently. So, like, there have been questions related to explainability and interpretability of these kind of deep learning models and stuff. Like, earlier, it was like pretty easy to explain a particular model whenever we are actually employing some machine learning stuff. But right now, models are getting complex and complex, layers and layers, and other additional stuff. So that's where explainability is actually lacking for many of the models, and it's very complex enough to explain the whole process as well. Most of the
Mm-hmm.
models are actually black box. So, what is your take on it? Like, is it really affecting the overall explainability, or the focus towards shifting to a responsible AI, and or is it like, in a way it's actually helping us to identify this is the process, or this is the way we should actually go about implementing a
Mm-hmm.
responsible AI system?
Mm-hmm. So the first part of your question was the importance of responsible AI. I think I answered this already earlier in our conversation that
Right.
responsible AI is tremendously important to do the right thing, to build the trust, and particularly for organizations also now to comply with regulations. Because, for example, in the European Union, the European entities are working on the upcoming AI Act, the first comprehensive law for artificial intelligence, which requires them to make sure and prove that the models are explainable, and many other parts in the world are moving in a similar direction. So it's important to do it, but nobody really knows, okay, what exactly is required in regards to explainability. And when I have conversations with scientists or practitioners about explainability, what I notice is that oftentimes you have two parts or two different directions in which this conversation can go. If you talk with more the data scientists, the technical folks, they oftentimes talk about Shapley values and explainability that helps them to also debug the model and better understand what's going on. But I think when we look into the law that's currently being drafted, they are more interested in a kind of more high level explanation. That's something that also end users could digest, because there it's not necessarily, particularly when we look into how large models are getting nowadays, that you explain the user, okay, with these billions of nodes, ways where we could go in another direction. This is how we came to your specific decision, because nobody in the general public will be able to digest this or make sense out of it. But on a very high level, figuring out, okay, what type of explanation can I give a person that's satisfying and that really helps this organization to understand this person to understand how this decision was derived, is something that I think we will see much more. There's not yet, to my knowledge, a perfect answer how to derive to this uh, at this general, easily understandable explanations of models. But one thing that I, for example, know is quite important is that they would also know, okay, what kind of information had a huge impact on the decision. So, for example, was it my ethnicity that led to the yes or no answer? This is something that people definitely should be aware of and have the right to know, because this would give them the possibility to also start a court case against a certain algorithm and so on and so forth. But it's definitely a tricky topic with models getting larger and larger.
Okay, yeah. So over to my next point. Actually, anyway, these topics are pretty important, but I don't think many companies are actually focusing on implementing something related to responsible AI or implementing the exact procedure for it. Like, so as a result, like anyway, like I've seen some brilliant examples from companies like Alan AI, who is actually developing something related to like
Mm-hmm,
a model which is more ethical. Okay, so
mm-hmm.
like whenever we are actually giving an example, it will actually suggest, okay, whether it is good, bad, or what does it think
Interesting.
specifically. So it's a project called Ask Delphi, and
Mm-hmm,
but what I noticed is like companies actually don't invest much on these topics, even if they know that it's important. So, are you aware of any companies who are actually focusing on these kind of topics? I know mostly AI is actually definitely doing it. So, apart from
mm-hmm.
that, like, is there any other companies which you are aware of, like, who is actually focusing on this kind of stuff? Because I
Good
know the
question.
monetization point is actually pretty low there. So, as a result,
Mm-hmm,
like, it is
mm-hmm.
pretty tricky there.
Yeah, good question. So I think it heavily depends on with which organizations you talk to. We, as a synthetic data company, our customers are some of the largest financial institutions, insurance organizations, telcos, and so on and so forth, also public sector organizations. So for these huge multinationals, responsible AI is a board level topic. It's highly important to the organization. And we see that not everybody is at the end destination. And the question is, will we ever be at the end destination of how to do AI responsibly and perfectly right? But they definitely are way beyond this initial stage of coming together as an organization and just formulating some mushy AI principles that then I don't know, are somewhere on a wall but don't end up in the products and how they develop them. And I think many of these organizations are progressing and looking for ways how they can really have robust, responsible AI governance processes in place. Some of the leaders in that space, I think, Microsoft is doing fantastic work when it comes to responsible AI. They also openly share some of their standards and how they approach it, and make sure that this is really also something that's translated to the engineers and how they develop their products. The other part of organizations you mentioned, we are in that space, is definitely smaller companies that see responsible AI becoming a huge topic and start developing solutions like our fair synthetic data solution. But I'm on the same page with you. They're not yet thousands of organizations out there focusing on the topic. And wondering if this is something that's going to change, or I actually expect that it is going to change, because besides all this regulation that is in place in the UK, in Europe, in China now also, and then in the United States, to name a few examples, we also see that some nations or economic regions in the world start preparing for AI assurance ecosystems. So what they want to do is build up ecosystems where you can have AI bias audits, some responsible AI certifications, or just in the first place, services and tools and consultancy to help organizations to make sure that their artificial intelligence is developed in a more responsible way. And they actually expect that this is going to be a multi-billion-dollar industry, because we all know there's a global AI talent shortage, but we have an even larger responsible AI talent shortage. So it can't be expected that every organization ventures on this responsible AI journey alone. They will need to have support to make sure that the AI not only fulfills the regulatory requirements, but is also something that the users of the organization like to use, trust the customers of that organization. And this is also an interesting field where we, for example, as our synthetic data, play a role, because whenever you want to have some external party help you with your model development, certify your model, audit your model, it's never sufficient to just share the code of the model. You need to have granular examples, particularly of extreme edge cases and minority groups, to make sure and see how is this model actually behaving for these rarer circumstances. And of course, whenever we talk about granular customer data, privacy is an issue. And this is why many of these regulators and also now insurances and some others who want to position themselves in the AI assurance ecosystem are turning to us and other synthetic data providers to find a way how they could bridge this need of getting access to granular data while protecting privacy.
Got it. Got it. So, so over to the regulatory body part. So, like, what all regulatory bodies or regulations are actually there, like evaluating these kind of fairness in AI
Mm-hmm.
models?
Mm-hmm. So I won't not say that there's not yet any regulation out there because AI, as any other product out there, has to fulfill certain non-discrimination requirements that we see in anti-discrimination law and so on and so forth. Plus, with GDPR, we also have a few obligations that you could argue help with responsible AI. One thing I'm criticizing, though, or I'm advocating to change, is that we see certain elements in the existing law that contradict how responsible AI is done in practice. To give you an example, with GDPR and also with some anti-discrimination laws, they require organizations to not use sensitive attributes like sexual orientation, ethnicity, and so on and so forth. But state-of-the-art AI fairness practitioners in or state-of-the-art ways to achieve AI fairness in artificial intelligence actually require the data scientists and developers to have access to those sensitive attributes to develop a model that's truly colorblind, ethnicity blind, gender blind, and so on and so forth. So here we see how current regulation is actually hurting AI, and I've also had conversations with some of the leading companies and their AI practitioners, and they told me there are even instances where existing regulation introduces more bias in models just to comply with the regulation, which is also not the direction we want to head in. So I would say many of the laws we have in place when it comes to AI and AI fairness are in desperate need of an overhaul to make sure that there are no conflicts and that developers can create AI that's fair and also compliant with regulation.
Okay, okay, got it. So, so my next point is on the synthetic data, which you have actually pretty much explained. So, like, I have one specific question on this. So, like,
Mhm.
so, so how does synthetic data address some of the ethical and privacy concerns? So, actually, that point something which you actually already mentioned. So that's something like, so from my understanding, we have some very personal information which we need to kind of transfer, or like on the modeling process we need to share with some third party. We can actually augment this by doing some synthetic data. So
Mhm.
apart from that, like, what are other use cases which synthetic data can be actually used in this whole pipeline basically?
Mhm. Mhm. So, since you just mentioned augmenting synthetic data is not really a technology, at least when it comes to privacy protection, where you augment data, but it's really, you have, let's say, as an organization, a data set with 200 columns, and there are PII fields in there. PII is a defined term in the United States and talks oftentimes about some direct identifiers like social security number, your name, your address, and so on and so forth. This type of information for everybody is quite obvious that it's privacy sensitive. But in a big data world, what's even more sensitive, beside this kind of clear text information about you as a person, is your behavioral data. So how you spend your money, on what you spend your money, when you spend your money is so unique to you as an individual and makes up your digital fingerprint, that if this information would be left intact or just slightly distorted with legacy anonymization approaches, it would be easy to use some auxiliary information and reconnect it and come back to you as a person. So with synthetic data, you take the complete data set with the 100 or 200 columns, whatever I just said 1 minute ago, and run it through the software to get a complete synthetic version of these 200 columns out there. And this is really the only way how you can make sure that privacy is protected and that your digital fingerprint is not used against you and to come back to your sensitive medical or financial information and so on and so forth. Since you mentioned how it is used, the top cases for synthetic data in that privacy context are definitely AI training. You know that AI needs more granular data than in nearly any other data-driven application. So most of our customers use it to train their algorithms on synthetic data. And since the structure of the data is identical to the real data, they can develop the models on synthetic data and then immediately deploy those models in production on the real world data. Besides AI training, the second biggest use case is actually data sharing, external data sharing. If you talk with large organizations, depending on how fast and mature they are, you hear that external data sharing oftentimes takes 3 months, 6 months, 8 months, so really ages in our fast-paced world. And particularly for organizations that want to drive digital transformation, that want to innovate, they're highly interested in using cloud resources, in collaborating with startups or let's say an AI vendor, or even with a research firm or something like that. And all of these scenarios require the sharing of highly granular privacy safe data. And this is where synthetic data can help them to reduce this amount of time from many months to actually with our customers would be just a few days or even internally when they want to access data, a matter of hours. So that's a huge game changer for them, or also for those organizations that have subsidiaries in different parts of the world. From a legal point of view, that's external data sharing. So with synthetic data, they're much quicker in gathering data from around the world and developing a model that also works for everybody around the world. The last point where we see synthetic data being used in this privacy context is when it comes to product development and software testing. Also with software testing, it's not necessarily that you need the highly representative, statistically useful data like in the AI context, but you for sure need to have realistic data that gives you access to all the different edge cases and peculiarities about your data to make sure that you can properly test your systems. So that's another element where we see it. And since you also talked about synthetic data's role in this responsible AI context, so I mentioned already earlier that the most common pillars of responsible AI are human oversight, privacy, and I think I just explained how synthetic data helps with that, security, fairness, explainability, transparency, robustness. I see currently the biggest role of synthetic data with fairness, for example, with fair synthetic data, but also by just giving developers access to sensitive attributes in a privacy safe way to make sure that they can develop models that are colorblind, and even to facilitate this AI assurance ecosystem bias audits where data is shared with external auditors to help them evaluate and certify the model, for example. Plus, it's also in the explainability context. I've actually worked with NVIDIA here and Hewlett Packard on explainable AI as a service. We already mentioned offering services in that regard is definitely a need in industries. So also here, synthetic data can be used to help you outsource kind of explainability and use services that are available for that. So yeah, stopping here now because that was a pretty long answer.
It's pretty impressive actually, like how this whole uh, the whole concept of synthetic data is being applied over different set of
Mhm.
use cases all over this. And
Absolutely. Sorry, one other thing before we continue with the next question. The use cases that I just mentioned are what we most commonly see with private sector organizations plus public sector organizations. But one other element where I have high hopes for synthetic data and the change it will lead to is actually that it can be used to safely share data in an open manner. So open synthetic data. For example, we worked with the Joint Research Center of the European Commission because they wanted to openly share cancer data of 50 million Europeans to give broader access, grant broader access for researchers, but also policymakers. And everybody working with data knows that oftentimes data is siloed, it's restricted, it is there, but it's hidden in organizations, and particularly smaller organizations, startups, small and medium enterprises, or research organizations or NGOs have a terrible hard time getting access to relevant, meaningful data. And my hope is that synthetic data will be much more used in the future to have these open data spaces where healthcare data, financial data, mobility data is available out there to facilitate great innovation, and also applications of AI that not only serves organizations, but that actually serves society in this context of AI for good.
Really great, actually. So, regarding your company, mostly AI. So, could you give us a overview on like how it is and what exactly and how much they are actually committed towards this responsible AI?
Okay, perfect. So you asked about our commitment towards responsible AI, and I would also add our commitment towards privacy. I think everybody within our team is highly motivated and purpose-driven when it comes to helping our society to reconcile data utilization with privacy protection, and also to make sure that models are built in a more responsible, ethical way. So that's one of the main factors why people join our team. From a team size or skill set perspective, I mean, quite a lot has happened. We were founded in 2017. At the beginning of the pandemic, we were roughly like 16 people, and now we are, I don't know, approaching the 50. So we also had our next investment round expanding to the United States, and therefore we, on the one hand, have of course sales and product and marketing team that helps us to pull all of that off and serve our customers. But particularly, and I think this is what you're interested about from our tech point of view, we have an exceptional engineering and data science team with really world-leading expert when it comes to generative AI, deep learning, and also privacy engineering. So I'm really proud of the people that we have in our team. Plus, another element I'm super proud of is that we have currently 23 different nationalities. We are a remote first organization, so you can join us from any part of the world, and we really embrace this diversity, and that's a wonderful environment to work in.
Great to hear. Actually, it's pretty cool.
Perfect. Maybe also for your
So,
listeners, if anybody currently looking for an exciting job, check out our website.
perfect. So this is my last question actually. So regarding the future of AI, and so uh, my understanding is this. So mostly AI is actually there are so many models, and actually this is something which you have also mentioned. So none of us are actually starting from the scratch. Most of the cases, there are already so many models which are pre-built, and we are leveraging these models to build based on our use cases, or we are actually uh, what to say fine tuning over the data which we are currently having as per our requirements. So uh, do you believe that the developments of these models from the scratch at that time itself, at the inception phase itself, is it better to actually focus on how we can build a responsible AI pipeline approach, or follow a pipeline approach like that, or after building this particular model, we'll be able to kind of implement some of these procedures to kind of fix it
Mm-hmm.
the
Mm-hmm.
entire issues.
That's an excellent question. So one thing, also when I think back to the current draft text of the AI regulation, where there is some argument and discussion about the responsibility when it comes to fairness and explainability and so on and so forth, that the huge tech firms should have when they develop some kind of general purpose, facial recognition, speech recognition, and so on and so forth. And there's a quite interesting conversation going on, because some argue, and they have points to that argument, that, well, okay, if you develop a general purpose model, you would never know all the many ways in which it could be deployed and end up into a product that hits the market, and therefore you can't be the one responsible to, or hold responsible to fulfill all the responsible AI requirements. Others say, okay, well, if somebody's using this pre-trained model and doesn't get all the necessary information about how modeling decisions were made, how fairness was taken into account, and so on, how in the world should this person be able to fully account for what was done? where he or she was not involved. So it's a tricky balance to strive, but I think realistically speaking, we won't have hundreds of organizations that are providing models or these kind of huge supermodels, but we will have a handful of organizations, particularly also organizations with vast resources and deep pockets. So I'm more in favor of those requiring the general purpose AI system providers to fulfill stricter requirements and be very thorough in their documentation of this concept of data sheets, data cards, system cards, and so on and so forth. And in the future, since this is still a emerging research field, potentially also some more things where they really fulfill all the information obligation to help the one using the system comply with AI with AI responsible AI regulations and make sure that they have responsible models. But to that, or besides that point, even since this is such an emerging field, I could also imagine that we come up with some solutions that could be implemented at a later point in time. So I think we will see lots of innovation. We still have to figure many things out when it comes to explainability, fairness, transparency, and so on and so forth. And in the end, we will see which solution flies and what's the best approach to tackle it. But in general, having strict obligations for those companies that have the resources to fulfill it and who arguably will provide, I don't know, 90% of the models to the rest of the world to incorporate and package in the systems is a good starting point to make sure that we really, on a wide scale, have AI that's somewhat responsible.
Right, right. So that covers all my question for today, actually. And thank you very much, Alexandra, for giving such a great explanation on different aspects regarding. And I think we have covered a lot of
I think
topics,
so
actually.
too. I think so too. It was a pleasure, Deepak. Very much. Thank you for inviting me and also for your thoughtful questions.
It was pretty impressive, like how the whole system is actually connected in terms of the data, in terms of the process, in terms of the development, and it's pretty cool how you actually explain the whole stuff. And really thanking you for all the great work which you are doing in mostly AI, and kudos
Thank
to
you
the
very
team.
much, Deepak.
And thank you very much.